Well, you know, what is that phrase? You come in from the cold, but look, some of us came in from the sun and the warmth into the auditorium. I'm Nanette Macy Jones. I think I know most everybody here. So I'm the director, and thank you for coming out for this lecture. It's our second major event for the inaugural year of the Shackelford George Bellows Center opening. We having an inaugural year of celebrations. This is also, by the way, in addition to being hosted by the Bellows Center, it is also the Keith and Nadine Pierce Annual American Art Lecture. So we have sort of two hosts today, but I do appreciate you coming out. There are lots of people on Zoom, so we are Zooming it, and we're going to also record and post the lecture. I already had someone call me today that said, so I'm in my garden, and you know, if I did the Zoom, then I didn't have to take a shower to come downtown. And I said, okay. So I think there are people who are sweaty at home and decided home was the place to be. And while they join us that way, but it is going to be my honor to introduce Charles Brock, who we call Charlie, but his formal name is Charles Brock, who is the Associate Curator of American and British Paintings at the National Gallery in Washington. And the reason we're greatly honored to have him here is that the last great retrospective that on George Bellows, which was in 2012, was done at the National Gallery, and he was the lead curator on that project. We were the largest lender, and another point of great distinction for this exhibition, it was that the National Gallery was able to get it to travel to Europe. So it not only went to the Met in New York, so it was at the National Gallery in Washington, it was the Met in New York, and it made it to London. It was the National Gallery in London, which is really important that we are able to, our European friends are able to see historic American art as well. So it was a really exciting moment for those of us involved in Bellows. Charlie has been at the National Gallery since 1990. He and I were comparing notes of how long. I beat him. I have been here in some form since 1984, but close. We're going. He's done a lot of great projects. I could sit here and give you, just list all these projects. Most recently, though, he has done a project with our very dear friend Anne Dumas, who is the adjunct curator of European art here at the museum. She is based in London at the Royal Academy, but she just did this great project on Whistler. In fact, in case you're interested, we're taking a trip to Washington in the fall to be with Anne, and I think Charlie will be there as well to see the Whistler exhibition. Instead of listing lots of things Charlie did, I thought I would read two paragraphs from the review in the Washington Post for the 2012 retrospective, because I think it sort of sets the stage. Charlie's going to really focus on art and social justice with Bellows today, but this sort of sets the stage for his thinking about Bellows. So give me just a minute to read these two paragraphs to you. Some large retrospectives feel like mountainous territory, peak after peak in an artistic life filled with triumphs. The National Gallery of Art's large exhibition devoted to the work of George Bellows, the first major Bellows show since a 1992 painting retrospective in Los Angeles, feels more like pieces of puzzle. A fascinating, imperfect puzzle. And when you have finished exploring the diversity of an American artist who died tragically young at the age of 42 in 1925, you may not feel as if the puzzle is quite complete. But if you emerge willing to think pluralistically about modernism, that there was no monolithic modernism with a capital M. I have it on my phone, so I have to go and I screwed it up. There we go. Okay. So there was no. It's causing me trouble. Okay, wait, we'll just go back and do it this way. I will read that sentence again. But if you emerge willing to think pluralistically about modernism, that there was no monolithic modernism with a capital M, but rather a host of different modernisms, often in conflict with one another, then the works of Bellows will make more sense, and the curators will have accomplished their primary goal. As with so many artists, poets, and composers who lived during periods that seemed, at the time, wildly eclectic and are considered decades or centuries later historically transitional, Bellows is unclassifiable. If you ignore large tracts of his work, he can, at best, be pigeonholed. This exhibition demands that Bellows' oeuvre be considered as a whole, including a room of deeply disturbing paintings he made in response to World War I, political imagery that veers towards social caricature, and portraits in which the artist seems to be channeling the ethos of another era. In other words, a career of many modernisms. I leave you with that thought. Charlie, come up here and let's hear what you have to say, sir.
Thank you, Nanette. Yeah, Philip's a great writer, Philip Kennicott, for the post. Happy to hear that again. Thank you, everyone at the Columbus Museum of Art. And of course, thank you all for coming in on what really is a spectacular day out there. It's great to be back here. I can't believe it's been a decade since we did the big retrospective, but it's wonderful to be back and speaking here today. So let's begin. I wanted to say to begin, you'll note the original title was George Bellows, Art and Politics. Now I've added boxing, because boxing is going to be a central, it'll be pretty wide ranging. And I ask your patience, but it is going to focus on boxing. So let's begin. Also from Ohio, like Bellows, Robert Henri was one of the most influential teachers of his era. Henri urged his students to move beyond what he disdained as the too easily appealing, genteel scenes then favored by the conservative National Academy of Design, and instead to seek out contemporary subjects that would challenge prevailing standards of taste. These subjects were close at hand, waiting to be discovered within the teeming grid of New York City. Henri encouraged his students to experience this new life directly and on their own terms, and to forge their own individual styles in response to it. As he had done previously with the newspaper illustrators he had befriended in Philadelphia, Henri directed artists to act, as he put it, as sketch hunters, fully immersing themselves in the manic activity of New York in an attempt to capture urban life in every dimension. Henri wanted his students to engage difficult realities that had been largely ignored, not so much to offer specific political solutions to them, but to instead unsettle received notions. The goal was to disturb and to be problematic, to raise questions, not to answer them in any pat way. In following the path of, quote, art for life's sake, unquote, young artists aspired to break down the distance between the studio and the street, between their bodies and the bodies they depicted, between the act of painting and the act of living. Henri admired the radically democratic spirit of the 19th century poet Walt Whitman and opposed the elitist art for art's sake aestheticism practiced by his older rival at the New York School of Art, William Merritt Chase. He exhorted his students to expand their vision beyond Chase's more socially acceptable subject matter and the privileged trappings of, for instance, A Friendly Call. After dropping out of Ohio State University in 1904, Bellows departed for New York and quickly absorbed Henri's lessons about the folly of academic art and the imperative to be a truly modern painter. Bellows remarked on the, quote, strange disease in people's minds, which makes them imagine themselves arbiters of beauty, a criticism of manners or morality which presents the cruelty of life, is a horror to smug individuals, and believe me, the Academy is full of them. Bellows, like Henri, believed that, quote, the artist must be a spectator of life, a reverential, enthusiastic, emotional spectator. Bellows later recalled how Henri changed the course of his life. I arose surrounded by Methodists and Republicans. My mother wished me to be a bishop. My father planned for me to become president of a bank. By sheer luck, I found myself in my first art school under Robert Henri, never having heard of him before. I had every equipment except all the essentials. My brains were as innocent as a college could make them. My life begins at this point. The rest is legend. Painted just after Bellows' 27th birthday, perhaps no painting embodied Henri's ambition for the new wave of American artists more than both members of this club. My talk today will look at how both members was, in both its subject matter and style, a singular modernist work at the time it was first exhibited in 1910. Turning to the issues of race that the painting engages, I'll then discuss how Bellows and the Henri Circle were understood in relation to American modernism and African American art by the Howard University philosopher and art historian Alain Locke in his landmark 1936 book, Negro Art, Past and Present. I'll then consider how Chester Dale's gift of both members of this club to the National Gallery of Art in 1944 was a critical first step in the National Gallery's efforts to address how American art, modern art, and African American culture were represented. Beginning with very little American painting or contemporary art of any kind in its collections, this provocative painting marked the gallery's entry into what would become an ongoing conversation about American cultural identity, which continues at the National Gallery up to the present day in ways that I believe Locke would have recognized and, having lived in Washington, to a great degree encouraged. Finally, I'll conclude by looking at the relationship between the paintings of George Bellows and the lyrics and music of Bob Dylan in the early 1960s to demonstrate how Bellows' approach to the theme of boxing continued to resonate in surprising ways into the second half of the 20th century. The comparison is also meant as a reminder of how different the history of American art might have been had Bellows not died at the age of 42 in 1925, but had lived into the 1960s, like his contemporaries Edward Hopper and Rockwell Kent. When Bellows chose to depict club fights as a way to advance Henri's modernist agenda, he could not have chosen a more controversial subject. His boxing paintings reflected the shifting realities of boxing in New York City following the enactment of the Lewis Law in 1900, which prohibited public matches. In response to this prohibition, athletic clubs sprang up across the city, much like speakeasies later would during the 1920s. These institutions skirted the law against public fights by holding widely publicized matches featuring professional and amateur boxers from around the country, under the ruse that they were somehow private matches between the members of private clubs. Bellows observed these fights firsthand at the Irish-American and former heavyweight Tom Sharkey's athletic club located across the street from Bellows' studio in the Lincoln Arcade building at Broadway and 66th. Sharkey's was a particularly notorious club. On March 19, 1908, the New York Times reported, "The Sharkey Athletic Club ran afoul of the police again last night, and the result was one of the most spectacular raids this club has experienced since it started its torturous career. In the fourth round, while the quote members were figuring out how the encounter would terminate, a man jumped into the ring and blew a whistle. The police inspector told all to keep their seats, then went in search of James Buckley, manager of the club, and Jimmy Kelly, who said he was the manager of pugilist. The trio were taken to the police station where they were charged with aiding and abetting a prize fight and violating the penal code. They were bailed out by a Columbus Avenue saloon keeper." Sharkey's also hosted interracial boxing matches near the time Bellows painted both members of this club. For instance, on August 4th, 1910, the Times reported that William Brown, a black boxer from San Francisco, knocked William Ford, a white fighter from Philadelphia, unconscious at the club. The account is a representative example of the era's tabloid journalism and resonates with Bellows' painting. When Ford dropped the last time, it was from a terrific right swing that landed on the white man's jaw, and the weakened fighter toppled over. His seconds jumped into the ring to carry Ford to his corner, and they were shocked to find that he did not respond to the usual treatment, but remained in a coma. The club physician ordered Ford carried out to the dressing room. It seemed likely that death might ensue if Ford were not taken to a hospital, but the police were not informed of the accident. At 11:30, Ford was carried downstairs and into an automobile, which was driven hurriedly from in front of the club. The policeman stationed whenever there was a stag or a boxing show had left by this time. As soon as Brown saw the dangerous condition of his opponent, he left the club and could not be located after that. The police of the West 67th Street Police Station professed to know nothing of the accident. It has not been learned where Ford was taken. Both members of this club, like these newspaper narratives, calls into question the integrity of almost every aspect of this particular slice of American life. The painting implicates those who look and look away. Spectators, reporters, promoters, politicians, police, club doctors, athletes, and ultimately Bellows, the artist himself. It registers the desperate plight of a pair of Irish and African-American fighters from the nation's impoverished underclasses, locked in vicious combat in the boxing ring. One of the few arenas where, if they were fortunate enough to emerge with body and mind intact, they could earn money as well as make a name for themselves. At a time when the Comstock laws and other legal and moral strictures against the display and depiction of the nude were still very much in force in American society, the painting depicts an all-male venue where essentially naked masculine bodies are on violent display for the entertainment and enjoyment of other men. When Bellows' gendered homosocial boxing paintings were first exhibited, they were sometimes, like the actual fights, deemed off limits to female viewers and set aside in separate spaces for men's eyes only. The painting was finished shortly after Jack Johnson became the first African-American heavyweight champion of the world, and at a time when interracial matches were controversial and banned in many parts of the country. Bellows was keenly aware of how racially charged the subject was. After considering a highly provocative, incendiary title for the painting, incorporating a racial slur, he crossed it out of his record book and never used it. Bellows instead chose the more open-ended, elusive title, Both Members of This Club, which rather than framing the painting in narrow, starkly racial terms, left a full range of disturbing questions that the image conjures regarding class, gender, the body, and race, profoundly unsettled and in play. Confronted with the moment suspended in time, with the outcome of the fight still hanging in the balance, we are left to wonder what is happening and how the situation might ultimately resolve itself, what the audience, the boxers, and the artist are thinking, and finally, what our own thoughts are. The painting raises many provocative questions, but offers no definitive answers. Although a man of the left, who would become a major contributor to the socialist magazine, The Masses, in the teens, Bellows at this early stage of his career generally kept his art apart from political agendas, striving instead to convey his direct experience of events. Bellows stated, "I am not interested in the morality of boxing." His intent was instead more elemental. "I don't know anything about boxing. I'm just painting two men trying to kill each other." Bellows then offered this telling observation. "But let me say that the atmosphere around the fighters is a lot more immoral than the fighters themselves." The painting bears this out as we turn from observers into participants through three stages of perception. First, we circle the ring, scanning the leering audience around us, looking at the lookers. Next, we join the crowd and direct our gaze with them up towards the focus of their attention, the fighters looming above. Finally, looking past the ropes, we move into the center of the ring, an apex of the action, to identify with the fighters themselves. In both members of this club, Bellows, himself a tough, accomplished athlete in his own right, more than just rendering what is in front of him, conflates the physical act of painting with the physical act of boxing. His brush moves across the surface of his canvas in ways analogous to the slashing, intermittent jabs, feints, bobs, and weaves of a boxer. The odd angles and puzzling arrangements of the discontinuous ropes splinters the composition. The spatial confusion signals a transition from the more traditional realism of Bellows' at times grotesque depictions of the audience to the more disorienting experiential realism of the conflicted areas where the fighters and the artists commune. Here, the wide-eyed looking of the spectators outside the ring gives way to the half-blind bodily sensations of the fighters in the ring. At the painting's core, the two fighters collide and merge at a confluence of black and white, flesh and blood, where, through Bellows' intervention, their inner visible lives of viscera and consciousness, body and soul, are, it seems, somehow turned inside out and made visible, transmuted into something tangible and yet illegible and powerfully abstract, paint itself. In 1915, Bellows commented on the ways in which, in finding his subjects, he was absorbed by them. Every artist is looking for news. He is a great reporter of life, keeping his eyes open for some hitherto untold piece of reality to put on his canvas. His picture chooses him. He doesn't choose what he shall paint any more than a writer chooses the news that shall happen or the idea that shall possess him. Making the analogy between boxers and painters, Bellows' contemporary, the artist Guy Pen Dubois, commented on how difficult it was for artists to gain any kind of traction in American society. Without the attributes of the fighter, they could expect little or no success with an uninterested American public, Dubois wrote, and continued, which, when considering an artist at all, was wont to smile derisively. Pen Dubois' remarks reminds us that during the early 20th century, the status of American modernist artists, like that of the fighters in Bellows' painting, was often very precarious. The remark that Bellows made when an exhibition prize awarded for another depiction of nude male bodies of various hues, 42 Kids from the Corcoran collection, was abruptly rescinded in 1908. That is also relevant here. More than the display of nudity, Bellows declared, it was the naked painting that they feared. Because of the vehement assertion of the vital role played in American life by both boxer and artist, both because of what it shows and how it shows it, both its black and white subject matter and its violent, aggressive style, both members of this club, for all of the notoriety it gained Bellows, could not find a buyer. It was still in Bellows' possession when he died at the age of 42 in January 1925. Following both members of this club, Bellows engaged persistently with issues of sport and race in a number of lithographs. The White Hope, which commemorates Jack Johnson's defeat of Jim Jeffries in Reno, Nevada in 1910, and the savior of his race, a scene taken from Johnson's loss to Jess Willard in Havana, Cuba in April 1915, ridicule the racist obsession with finding a white boxer to supplant Johnson after he had claimed the heavyweight championship in 1908. Printed in the 1917 issue of The Masses, Benediction in Georgia satirizes the hypocrisy of a white preacher acting as a spiritual guide to Blacks incarcerated in the South. Finally, in 1923, Bellows produced The Law is Too Slow to illustrate Mary Johnston's short story Nemesis about a lynching and its moral and psychological repercussions for a small Southern town. Walter White, the executive secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and a fearless advocate for social justice, admired Johnston's story and Bellows' lithograph. White subsequently chose the Bellows print to serve as the cover and frontispiece to his landmark 1929 study of lynching, Rope and Faggot, and it was again featured among the works included in White's 1935 exhibition and catalog, an art commentary on lynching. Following White's landmark exhibition, Alain Locke, who had proclaimed the Harlem Renaissance with his 1925 anthology, The New Negro, published his art historical survey, Negro Art, Past and Present, in Washington, D.C. in 1936 as part of the Bronze Booklets series. In Past and Present, Locke presented a cogent analysis of where Henri and Bellows stood in relationship to African art, to European modernism, and African American art. Locke's account is worth quoting at length. The portrayal of Negro types by American artists, black and white, has become an ever broadening and deepening phase of realism and localism in American painting and sculpture. Reaching a deliberate point in the work and influence of Robert Henri, it has spread among most of the prominent Americanists, especially since 1908, when the Henri Group organized in New York to fight academic and cosmopolitan tendencies in the American art of their generation. Locke continues. George Bellows, Henri's pupil, by including Negroes frequently in his famous boxing, paintings, and lithographs, went in for American types and American life in the raw, with democratic disregard for social caste and artistic convention. The unconventionality that made Bellows do barrooms and prize rings brought him occasionally to the Negro subject, and he painted us entirely out of the plantation tradition. After this, Negroes were individuals, not mere types. Thus, the double standard was thrown overboard by the realist. In addition, we learn from Bellows' graphic indictment of lynching, "The law is too slow," and his benediction in Georgia, that he dared carry this theme through to social criticism and even propagandist protest. Some younger Negro artists followed. The scales of color prejudice fell from some eyes, and many Americans, black as well as white, saw more understandingly. Locke then proceeds to tie the state of contemporary African-American art to the state of American art in general during the 1930s. Quote, oddly enough, Negro art has come into its own by the very development most vital in contemporary American art, namely the desire to build an art freer from European influences and imitation, and to root American art in the materials and themes of the native scene. The startling changes of the last 10 years have proved that the Negro artist has as much or more to gain by coming home spiritually as the American artist in general. So after a long detour, Negro art has come to the fore, and progressive artists, black and white, have, at last, common grounds for promoting a fuller and more representative portrayal of Negro life. In 1937, the year after Locke published Past and Present in Washington, Congress officially authorized funds for establishing the National Gallery of Art. While Andrew Mellon's cultural philanthropy was universally acclaimed when the gallery opened its doors in March 1941, the gallery's small holdings of American art and emphasis on other national schools immediately raised concerns about whether it could truly claim to be a national museum. The regionalist painter from Missouri, Thomas Hart Benton, protested. There is nothing national whatever in Mr. Mellon's museum. We are fortunate to have it, to be sure, since the collection, properly regarded, may provide immense stimulation for art in this country. But the Mellon paintings are not our art, and we cannot for a moment regard them as such. If we don't want our culture to be a series of imitative gestures, we must keep our educational procedures out of the hands of those who are so certain that art is an attribute of the dead that they put 30-year death clauses in their purchasing programs to keep out the vulgarity of life. There were less than a dozen American paintings in the collection at the time, and the National Gallery was prohibited from accessioning works into the permanent collection until 2 decades after an artist died. In 1944, the gallery's early benefactor and trustee, Chester Dale, addressed these needs and restrictions in a very pointed way. Dale and Bellows had known each other in New York as young men, and Dale was a great champion and collector of Bellows' work. Realizing that after 35 years, both members of this club was still unsold, Dale purchased the painting from the artist's widow, Emma, with the express purpose of bequeathing it to the National Gallery of Art, so that it could be placed on view precisely on January 8, 1945, the 20th anniversary of Bellows' death. When the National Gallery's comprehensive reinstallation of the East Building premiered in 2016, Bellows' great boxing picture, as Elaine Locke and Chester Dale would have appreciated, was featured as a keystone of the gallery's display of 20th century American art. The sightline from both members of this club through the doorway at the right to Aaron Douglas's The Judgment Day in the second gallery reflects Locke's view, as stated in Past and Present, that Bellows' depictions of African-American boxers were notable precursors to the works of African-American artists of the 1920s and 30s. The juxtaposition is instructive. highlighting a dynamic Black athlete in the midst of a violent maelstrom, with Bellows' realist proclivities for rendering, as Locke put it, American life in the raw, on full display. Both members of this club delved headlong into the country's conflicted views regarding class, gender, race, and the body. Inspired by the last of James Weldon Johnson's sermon poems from his 1927 publication, God's Trombones, and evoking the performative folk traditions of African-American preachers in a modernist streamlined style with allusions to Cubism sources in African art, the Judgment Day is an ethereal religious image. The stances of Bellows' Black Boxer and Douglas's Lavender African Angel Gabriel mirror each other. Both protagonists are shown with one leg planted firmly on the ground and the other raised up and bent sharply at the knee as they loom over numerous figures below. While rooted in the disturbing physical and spiritual dilemmas that engulf their respective congregants, these figures also direct our attention affirmatively upwards towards the physical confluence of the boxer's gloves in Bellows' painting and towards the radiating light and sound of Douglas's work. Such correspondences illuminate how interrelated the harsh physical and psychological realities of Black athletes and the worldly and spiritual concerns of African-American preachers, poets, intellectuals, and artists were during the first half of the 20th century. And as Elaine Locke's analysis makes clear, how central and integral African-American culture in all its many dimensions has always been to the history of modernism in the United States. So moving beyond the evidence of the boxing images, how might we more broadly assess Bellows' political identity? His political interests are most apparent in his published drawings and lithographs. The lives of the poor and destitute in the city were the subject of many of his illustrations for the socialist magazine, The Masses. For example, Splinter Beach, or Why Don't They All Go to the Country for a Vacation? Bellows registered the plight of the homeless in Real Tragedy and of streetwalkers in the street. He satirized evangelicals in such works as Preaching Billy Sunday, as well as Prayer Meeting and the Sawdust Trail. And as we have seen, the plight of African Americans also concerned him in Benediction in Georgia, The Savior of His Race, and in The White Hope, and The Law is Too Slow. Bellows' political activities, like so much else, were influenced by Henri. Following the ambitious 1910 Independence exhibition organized by Henri in New York, Bellows had organized a presentation of the show here in his hometown of Columbus. When Henri came to lecture in Columbus in late January 1911, he took the opportunity to hear the anarchist political activist and writer Emma Goldman speak in Toledo. Goldman encouraged Henri to teach at the Farrer Center in New York, named after the anarchist educator who had been executed in 1909 by the Spanish monarchy for his anti-government views. When Henri began conducting classes there in March 1912, a founder of the school, Bayard Boyesen, gave a talk, Artists, Hope, and Anarchic Ideas, praising Henri as the teacher of such artists as Bellows and Kent. Boyesen explicitly linked the anti-academic, anti-authoritarian stance of the Henri group to anarchism, noting, quote, because all genuinely inspired artists have stood for absolute freedom of consciousness, they have necessarily stood exactly where the philosophic anarchists stand. Bellows taught alongside Henri at the Farrer Center and was associated with many other prominent left-wing anarchist and socialist causes and organizations throughout the teens. In March 1912, he donated a drawing to a fundraiser given by the International Workers of the World to aid the children of mill workers who were on strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts. That May, he participated in a massive march up Fifth Avenue with his wife, Emma, in support of women's rights. And in November, voted for Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate for president. In March 1914, Bellows and Emma attended a protest in support of unemployed workers, followed by a walk to the Farrer Center led by Goldman. In January 1915, Bellows covered the religious revival meetings of Billy Sunday in Philadelphia with the journalist John Reed, who would later achieve notoriety as a witness to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. In 1916, Bellows attended a dinner in support of Goldman after she was charged under the Comstock law for advocating birth control. In March 1917, the Bellows drawing Christ in Chains, previously printed in the masses, was published in the San Francisco anarchist magazine, The Blast, edited by Goldman's associate, Alexander Berkman, who was infamous for having attempted to assassinate the steel magnate Henry Clay Frick. Electrocution of 1917 is thought to allude to the threatened execution of the labor leader Tom Mooney, who was falsely accused of having bombed a pro-war parade in San Francisco in 1916. From 1915 to 1918, Bellows also lent works of art to some of the more than 50 exhibitions organized by the anarchist John Weichsel for his People's Art Guild. The Guild was an artist-run institution who sold their art directly by staging large shows in settlement houses and gathering places of New York's poorer districts. Weichsel conceived of the Guild as a radically democratized means of exhibiting without the go-between of commercial dealers. Bellows' views on the politically contentious issue of American participation in World War I was complex. In the wake of an artist strike at the masses in 1916, he argued that the editorial board, headed by the socialist Max Eastman, should not dictate the artist's contributions to the magazine and insisted Eastman, quote, get rid of the obvious heavy propaganda, unquote. In March 1917, the same month in which Berkman published The Pacifist Christ in Chains, Eastman asked contributors to the masses to sign a petition opposing America's entry into the war. Somewhat surprisingly, Bellows refused, saying, the masses has no business with a policy. It is not a political newspaper. Following the United States declaration of war against Germany that April, Bellows, profoundly disturbed by the Bryce Commission's report on war crimes in Belgium, frankly and publicly admitted that he was struggling with the issues that war had catalyzed in him. I cannot put my finger on my war psychology at all. I hate the thought of fighting, but I am all for democracy. You see, it tangles a fellow up pretty badly. I have been called a revolutionist. If I am, I don't know it. First of all, I am a painter, and a painter gets hold of life, gets hold of something real, of many real things. That makes him think, and if he thinks out loud, he is called a revolutionist. I have always felt about art that it was freedom that counted. A man must see things and say things in his own way. Bellows' work as a graphic artist and his series of prints and paintings supporting America's entry into the war support the view of his political identity as expressed by Art Young, the talented cartoonist and illustrator for the masses, in his 1928 memoir, On My Way. And here you see Young's caricatures of Bellows on the right and John Sloan on the left, and other interesting characters. Recalling Bellows' wish to work for Goldman's Mother Earth, Young described him as a, quote, rebel individualist, more anarchistic in his philosophy than socialistic. While he may have depicted social realities, Bellows believed it was the artist's primary imperative to express his individual point of view apart from the dictates of any political organization. Always wary of mass movements or group sentiments of any kind, he instead freely associated himself with a variety of organizations from left to right across the political and cultural spectrum, from the National Academy of Design to the People's Art Guild, and from the masses to the US government's Fourth Liberty loan drive during World War I. His paintings of crowds and war assert his own identity as an artist and the primacy of the individual in a chaotic, violent, and often coercive world. As Bellows stated, watch all good art and accept none as a standard for yourself. Think with all the world and work alone. We are left with the question about how much did Bellows really care about politics? Was he an advocate for social progress and justice? I think Bellows certainly cared, but as is the case with many artists, his art guided him through the difficult moral and ethical issues of his day. Adhering to Henri's motto, art for life's sake, Bellows' art served the mysteries of life, not partisan political agendas. The leading proponent of literary naturalism, Theodore Dreiser, perceived an artist who ultimately went beyond the bounds of politics. Regarding the vast crowds in works like Cliff Dwellers or Riverfront Number 1, Dreiser wrote, "Pushing and moving and seeking, as life in its dumb, blind masses is always pushing and seeking, like clouds, like smoke, more news of the united workers of the world. But Mr. Bellows, like every true artist, is unconcerned as to that. What will be, will be. Instinctively and truly, he senses the now. With his palette and brush and a piece of canvas, he evokes it all out of the inner intuition, which is deeper than all such crowds as these. By contrast, they are mere shadows, flotsam and jetsam on the tides of time." Born 60 years apart, George Bellows from Ohio and Bob Dylan from Minnesota were both Midwesterners. Both were prodigies who came to New York City in their early 20s and found their way into the bohemian avant-garde cultural circles of Greenwich Village and quickly established names for themselves in their respective fields. Both were keen observers who often drew their realist subjects from the current events of the day, thereby transforming the topical life of the city into art. Both were drawn to boxing and the plight of African-American boxers. Finally, both were quote unquote rebel individualists who created works of art on the theme of boxing and issues of race that eluded precisely defined political agendas in order to engage with larger, more profound existential issues that could never be definitively resolved or articulated. Regarding his boxing pictures, Bellows had stated, "I am not interested in the morality of boxing. I don't know anything about boxing. I am just painting two men trying to kill each other." In the same disarming way, Bob Dylan commented on his song, "Who Killed Davey Moore?" It's got nothing to do with boxing. It's just a song about a boxer, really. It's taken directly from the newspapers. Nothing's been changed except for the words. I close my presentation today with a comparison between both members of this club of 1909 and Dylan's 1963 song, "Who Killed Davey Moore?" What you'll be seeing and hearing here is a 3-minute film that documents the last fight of Davey Moore, the acclaimed African-American featherweight world champion, who died shortly after losing his title to the Cuban boxer Sugar Ramos on March 21st, 1963. The trio of film, song, and painting in concert all raised disturbing questions about art, politics, and sport that Americans have struggled to address across the 20th century and up to the present day. Dylan once claimed that, quote, "All my songs are protest songs. All I do is protest." A similar spirit of revolt against the status quo animates not only Bellows' boxing images, but many other paintings, drawings, and prints by him as well. Thank you so much for your attention. And now we'll play the film.
Who killed Davey Moore? Why and what's the reason for? Not I, said the referee. Don't point your finger at me. I could have stopped it in the 8th and kept him from his tragic fate, but the crowd would have booed, I'm sure, at not getting their money's worth. It's too bad he had to go, but there was pressure on me too, you know. It wasn't me that made him fall, you can't blame me at all. Who killed Davey Moore? Why and what's the reason for? Not us, said the angry crowd, whose voices filled the arena loud. It's too bad he died that night. We just like to see a good fight. We just like to see some sweat. There ain't nothing wrong in that. It wasn't us that made him fall. You can't blame us at all. Who killed Davey Moore? Why? And what's the reason for? Not me, said his manager, puffing on a big cigar. It's hard to say, it's hard to tell. I always thought that he was well. It's too bad for his wife and kids he's dead, but if he was sick he should have said, it wasn't me that made him fall, you can't blame me at all. Who killed Davey Moore? Why and what's the reason for? Not me, said the gambling man, with his ticket stub still in his hand. It wasn't me that knocked him down, my hands didn't touch him none. I didn't commit no ugly sin, anyway I put money on him to win. It wasn't me that made him fall, you can't blame me at all. Who killed Davey Moore? Why and what's the reason for? Not me, said the boxing writer, who pounds the print in his old typewriter, saying boxing ain't to blame, there's more danger in a football game, saying fist fighting is here to stay, it's just the American way. It wasn't me that made him fall, you can't blame me at all. Who killed Davey Moore? Why and what's the reason for? Not me, said the man whose fists laid him low in a cloud of mist, who come here from Cuba's door, where boxing ain't allowed no more. I hit him, yes, that's true, but that's what I'm paid to do. Don't say murder, don't say kill, it was destiny, it was God's will. Who killed Davey Moore? Why and what's the reason for? Oh boy.
I want to thank you all again for coming. Instead of doing questions in the auditorium, what I thought we could do perhaps is the Shackelford George Bellows Center is open. It's actually open 6 days a week. It's not always open on Sundays, but it is open today on Sunday. And I think Charlie will go up there, and people that would like to talk to him could do it there. The center today has some special things in it. The great master drawing, football drawing that we acquired last year, thanks to the Shackelford family, is on display on the easel up in the center. We also have three paintings from the Bellows collection that you don't see quite so much on display on the walls. And George Bellows' granddaughter, Marion Kearney, has just given to the museum copies of the masses. We actually don't own any issues of the masses. And she's given us several issues that have, illustrations by Bellows in them. So they're up in the center as well. So the center, of course, is just go upstairs as if you're going to go out to Broad Street. It's one of the two rooms off of the Broad Street lobby. If you've not been there, you need to see it. I want to end by again thanking Charlie for joining us and giving us a very compelling lecture and new thoughts about. I don't think I would have ever thought about George Bellows and Bob Dylan, and and having. I was just last week in Dresden, where they've done a wonderful exhibition with our Edward Hopper, which pairs Edward Hopper with a Vermeer. Again, something I would never have thought. So there are wonderful new thoughts that are brought to us by people that spend their time helping us understand artists and the works that they create. And I end by again thanking Don and Techie Shackelford and their whole family. I think most of us in this auditorium and on Zoom know that the Shackelfords have endowed the Curator of American Art position, which we will be filling with the new director. And they have also are the reason that we have the George Bellows Center. That was a vision of theirs to continue to study an artist that means so much to us, not only across the globe, but here in Columbus, Ohio. So I again thank them and their whole family. Please join me up in the George Bellows Center and we will continue the conversation.